All right, we are live.
Okay, we are live. We're still getting things a little bit set up. I'm attempting to get this set up on Twitch as well. So if you're on Twitch, you can find me over there on Stories from the Pantry. Eventually, this channel will have lots of stories from lots of people about their favorite recipes and how they came to be and how to make them. But for now, since we're all kind of isolated in our own little homes, we're doing a bunch of live videos on how to cook stuff since you're all trapped at home, and since a lot of you went out and bought a ton of flour, you might as well know how to make bread. Do you know if it's streaming on
Yeah, no, we're good to go.
Twitch?
I don't know if it's streaming on Twitch, but we'll know it afterwards. We'll know.
Okay. Okay, so first thing we're going to do, if you didn't find the recipe, it's up on a blog post over on storiesfromthepantry.com, but you also can just follow along here. The way I make bread is a little bit different than a lot of the recipes you'll see where you have to proof the yeast and there's lots of steps. But one of the methods that I found early on that's a lot more forgiving is to go ahead and put your dry ingredients, some of them, in the bowl with the yeast, because then the temperature of the water can be off a little bit more and it not kill the yeast. So this is a very simple process to make a nice yeast dough. You can use it for making loaves of bread, for rounds if you don't have loaf pans. This is great for pizza crusts. We'll see where it takes us. I am using bread flour simply because when I went to buy bread, this is what I could find. So we're going to put a couple of cups of flour in the bowl. And you're going to want a big bowl because you're going to need to beat it, and it'll have about 4 cups of water. So you need enough room for all that to work around. You don't have to use bread flour, just all-purpose flour will work. You can do a combination of whole wheat and regular flour. You can also use the gluten-free flours that are out there, but it will change the texture, and you will have to experiment more with the amount of liquid that you need. But if this is one of your first times baking bread, I highly recommend that you only use all-purpose flour or bread flour because there's less to have to adapt for. So the next thing we're going to do is put in the yeast, and this one's just about empty. I buy it in the jar simply because it's cheaper. You can put it in the fridge and it'll last a good year. But if you've bought the packets, the little single serve packets, you're going to need 2 of the packets. If you're using loose, active, dry yeast, then a little bit less than a tablespoon. So we've used up all of that one, and now we're going to use this one. And we'll pour that in, and just about that much, and you're going to want it twice. I normally don't use tablespoons, so that's just about the same amount if you want to use a hand method. So we'll put that in. And now we're going to put the salt. For the salt, you're going to want about a teaspoon. I normally don't use measurings, but we'll do it here just so you can see the difference. So about that much salt. Salt slows down the process of yeast. So the reason you want to add salt is so that the yeast doesn't just overexpand and you get light, airy bread that falls apart. Sugar, on the other hand, activates it. So you can use either granulated sugar or honey, either way. I tend to use sugar for this recipe because it doesn't change the flavor. Honey will change the flavor a little bit. So we're going to put a couple of tablespoons of sugar. And now we're going to mix that around. We don't really need the the mixer yet. And I'm not using a stand mixer today just so that you guys can see it better and so that people who don't have stand mixers know how to do it. But if you have a stand mixer, you're still going to want this on your regular beater, not on the bread hook. So you're going to be mixing it like this. And notice yeast, salt, sugar, flour. They're all one ingredient now. So now is when we're going to add the warm water. Now, a lot of times I'll also add a little bit of oil, but for this very basic recipe, I don't add any oil at all, but oil will give it a little bit more elasticity. And you can add an egg if you like it. That'll make it slightly more cakey. Like for cinnamon rolls, it's really good. But for this, you literally just need warm water. So I put the temperature on the recipe on the blog somewhere between 105 and 115. But here's a good test. If you can handle putting your fingers under it and leaving it for a while, and you have normal sensing, if you have tons of calluses, that might not work. But it's about the temperature that you'd serve a baby bottle. So we're going to fill it up to the 4-cup mark. You're going to fill it. Your hand should be clean. This is a little bit tepid, so I'm going to pour some out, and I'm going to add some hot water because I want it to be warm enough to activate the yeast. So let's see. That's better. So that's enough. So if it's too cold that you wouldn't feed it to your baby, then it's too cold to feed to yeast. If it's so hot that it would burn your own finger or a baby's, then you shouldn't be putting it in the yeast. That's a real simple guide where you're not always having to stress and worry about whether you've gotten the exact temperature you want. This is the one time that you really need to have a beater. If not, you're going to have to take a whisk and beat the daylights out of this, because it's in the beating of the flour and the water and the yeast that you activate the gluten, and that's going to make all the difference in how your bread comes out. So I'm going to put this on low. I'm going to start playing this on. Very liquid. So we're going to add a little bit more flour. We're going to add a couple of cups more. And we're going to mix this in until we get kind of a thick dough. Not so thick that we can't beat it with these beaters, but just thicker than where it's not gooey like that. So there is our base for the bread dough. If you're using a stand mixer, you can continue to add dough till you have a really thick mixture, and then you can put in your bread hook and use it that way. But we're going to do this one by hand today so that you can see what that process is like. So now we're going to add more flour, and I think I may have to get more out of the pantry. Okay, so there's some for now. And we're going to mix this in. You can just use a spatula or a wooden spoon. You see it's very gooey and gluey, and that's your gluten starting to work. But it's still gooey enough that you really don't want to turn this out onto a counter yet. It's not enough. You're going to be kneading forever if you turn it out now. So let me grab some more flour. Okay. So far we've put in about 5 cups of flour. This will make 6. And this is probably going to be enough before we turn it out. Now if you use, there's 2 different types of yeast you can buy. The one is just the regular active dry yeast that's like this one here. The other is a bread flour yeast or a bread machine yeast. That one is fast acting, so you don't need to let it sit and raise nearly as long. It tends to have a little bit less consistency in how it raises, but it definitely speeds things up. So now as you can see, this is really thick. Now we're ready to start kneading. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some flour. My counter has already been sanitized and washed with soap and water with a little bit of Clorox in it. And I'm going to turn this out straight onto the counter, onto the floured surface. We're going to do as much as we can to get as much as we can from inside your bowl. Can't get all of it, but get as much as you can, because the more you rinse down the sink, the more you clog up your pipes. And someday you have to have a plumber come out and clean out your pipes because you have so much flour caked in there. So do what you can to get it as clean as possible. And now we're going to push all this over here. Keep your fingers covered in flour, and it'll be easier to drop it all onto here. Okay, so now looks like just still sticky, but almost ready to go. So we're going to sprinkle more flour on the top, and you're going to take it and you're going to fold it towards yourself, and you're going to fold it in on itself again. And if there isn't enough flour to keep your hands from getting sticky, put your hands in here, put flour on them, and then fold it again. And now you can fold it over, and now you have a good dough. Add a little bit more flour every time you turn it over, and because the goal is to work the flour into the dough, all the while you are kneading the dough and helping to activate the gluten and get the yeast mixed in all over the dough. This is actually really therapeutic. There's something tactile about kneading dough that's almost relaxing, because it's like it's this rhythm, and yet it'll let your brain wander. And with as much stress as most of us are feeling these days, having the ability to just sit and knead flour and yeast and water together to make something for our family can be really comforting. It's one of the reasons I like to bake. A few years ago, when I first started the company that we have, I pretty much gave up cooking at home. Just didn't have the time, and I found that without that outlet, I had a lot of stress and nowhere to send it. But doing this means that I get to put my brain in a different mode. I'm creating, I'm cooking. It's a completely different process than thinking and problem solving. And so it lets your brain have a vacation no matter what's going on. So as you can see, the dough is starting to hold together. It's starting to look really smooth. If I were to keep kneading and not add more flour, it's still at the point that it would be sticky if I completely worked it, which you don't want it to be. But we live in a dry climate, and so leaving your flour, your dough just a little bit sticky means it'll have better moisture for what you're wanting to do. Your bread will come out a little bit nicer than if you have it completely kneaded to the point that it's not sticky at all. If you live back east or you live somewhere in the south where you have high humidity, then you're going to want to add a little more flour so that your yeast is completely elastic and non-sticky. But if you're living somewhere where it's dry, this works. So now what we're going to do is, once you have it worked to this point, plenty of flour on the bottom, so it's not going to stick. We're just going to let it sit on the counter for about 10 minutes and rest. And in that amount of time, it's going to start letting the yeast activate. It'll rise, and then we can make it into whatever we want to. So you can cover it. If you have a pet, that means none of the pet hair gets on it. But it also means dust doesn't. It means any sneezing that happens doesn't. And while this is all going to be cooked in an oven at 300 and some degrees, the more you can do to protect it and keep it clean, the better off you are. So we're going to leave the flour out because we might need it again. But I think what we're going to do, at least what I'm going to do, you can turn this into about 3 bread loaves, or you can turn it into 1 bread loaf and a couple of large pizzas. And I'm sorry, I did dishes, and so that's our dishwasher draining, so sorry for the noise. You can make this into 1 loaf of bread and cinnamon rolls, a loaf of bread, a cinnamon loaf bread, and then pizza. You can also just make it into a pile of little mini pizzas that then you just cook in the oven for a couple of minutes on high to crisp the bottom, and then you can store them in your freezer, and you can even use like old carton lids to keep them stable on the bottom, and just wrap them in saran wrap and then put them in a Ziploc bag, and they make a great lunch for you to be able to pull it out, put your pizza sauce on top and some cheese, throw them in the oven, and you have a wonderful lunch for your family since everybody's home all day now. One of the other things I always do during this time is I actually do the dishes, because if you do the dishes, then when it comes back to the rest of this, you don't have a whole big mess to clean up that feels overwhelming when you're done. I won't do that today, but I am going to go stick these over here. We're going to run some water in them, and we're going to clean the flour off of our hands so that we don't have that layer when we go to cook. There we go. So we'll wash all of the flour that you currently have on your hands off. We may have to do it again once we're shaping. And I will wash some more soap. Make sure our hands are completely clean for this next step. And as you can see, now the flour is not going to bake onto that, so they're ready to clean easily once you're done and ready to do your dishes. Okay. Don't know that it's been quite 10 minutes. One other thing to know about bread. This is actually the point where you are going to want to turn your oven on, because once you reshape and you let that rise, then you want your oven to be the right temperature. If you have it heating up while you put the bread in, you'll end up with a denser, heavier loaf because it was cooking it while it was still raising. We're going to put it on bake. And I put mine on 350 degrees. Depending on how your temperature of your oven is, it's somewhere between 325 and 350 is good for baking bread. And we're going to prepare the bread pans. So what you're going to do, I do this over the sink so that all the grease that I'm spraying gets in the sink instead of on the floor and on the counter where I have to clean it up. So let's come and spray them. If you don't have no stick, that gets you every time. Let me wait so I don't breathe all that in. Ooh, okay. If you don't have no stick, you can use just regular cooking oil, and you can either take a pastry brush and rub it around if you've used regular oil, or you can use a paper towel and rub it around. But paper towels today seem to be a very precious commodity, so you can use your fingers, but it actually won't spread it as evenly as if you're using a small piece of paper towel or a brush. So I'm going to make 2 loaves out of this, and then the rest I'm going to turn into little pizza rounds for us for supper. Okay, so we put up all of the equipment that we're not using. We put up all of the unnecessary ingredients that we're already done with. If you have cinnamon and sugar, if you don't, just use an old spice jar and add cinnamon and sugar. We're going to make one of these a cinnamon swirl loaf. So, okay, let's check the bread. Oh, and by the way, you guys have to see this. My mother-in-law hand-stitched all of these tea towels. I have like 8 of them, and they're all with her decoration on them. And for about a year, I wouldn't use them. And she was over at our house one day, and she saw them all in our drawer, and she asked me, Hita, why aren't you using those? And I told her, because you made them and I want to keep them. And she told me, I made them for you to use, and they will be even more precious if they're stained because you used them. So that's a good lesson. So I use them now for just about everything that I need to do with baking, because not only is it cooking, but it's a happy memory every time I see them. So as you can see, your dough has started to spread. It's started to get a little bit bigger. So go ahead and flour your hands. And now we're going to punch down the dough and get out all of the air that's in there. You can see like there's little air bubbles. That's the chemical reaction starting to work. And we want to stop that reaction so that we can start it again once they're shaped into the shapes that we want. So we're going to take and divide the dough by thirds. If you want it to be exact and you have a digital scale, you can weigh them. But if you don't care if your bread loaves are exactly the same size, and it really doesn't matter that much. So now we have about 3 even pieces. We're going to use this one for the pizza crust. I'm going to turn this one into just a regular piece of bread loaf. So as you can see, it's not completely the shape it needs to be. One of the tricks is to make sure that your seam is completely sealed on the bottom, and then you can tuck the ends in if you don't want it to have like an ugly end. But one of the things you need to be careful of is that then your center can be really thin because you've added all this other dough to the edges. So kind of squeeze and get it about the right shape. And now you're going to take your bread pan and you're going to drop it in with the pretty side up, down, and then you're going to roll it over. So now you can see on this side, you can see those tucked edges. So we want to make sure that those are under there. And I have this lovely grease top, which is going to make it a little bit shinier and a little bit softer. If you don't like soft on the top, don't flip it in the oil, just put it flat in. If you're making just rounds because you don't have bread pans or you like a round loaf, you're going to go ahead and shape it and put it either on a cookie sheet or on parchment paper if you have a cooking stone. And you're going to let it raise completely to double the size. And then before you cook it, you're going to score it in some way. Otherwise, it will crack in an ugly way in the oven. So you're going to want to take a knife and make some kind of a cut. And that'll allow the flour to continue to raise, but in a guided way once it's under heat. We're going to turn this one into a cinnamon swirl loaf. You can add butter, either melted butter or just little pieces, chunks of butter, or you can do it the lazy way, like I do. And let's see. So we have it about the length of a loaf here. We're going to take and roll it out. And now we're going to pull it back, and as you can see, it's starting to stick under there. So we're going to add a little more flour here. And we're going to fold it that way. I'm going to pull it here, add a little more flour so it doesn't stick. And now we're going to make it a little bit thinner so we can have a couple of more turns. And this size here, you want it to be just a little bit longer than the length of your pan that you're putting it in. Okay, so now we have it pretty good square, not perfect, but pretty good. And you can see there's still little bubbles coming up, so the yeast is continuing to work. Here we go, here it is. So, this is oil, right? Look at that, ta-da! We now have oil where we can sprinkle our cinnamon and sugar. So now what we're going to do is I need some water, hold on. Ah, there we go. Okay. We're going to sprinkle cinnamon and sugar all over. You want to get the edges as much as you can. Otherwise, you have parts of your bread. Like, there's nothing more disappointing than getting served the end piece and knowing that all the middle ones have all this yummy cinnamon and sugar, and your end piece is about as boring as they come. And that's simply because you didn't put the cinnamon sugar all the way to the edge. So now here's the trick to when you need to roll. You need to make sure that you're getting as much of the air out as possible. Now, if you're going to make cinnamon rolls, all you would do is cut these afterwards and then lay them flat in a baking pan that's been greased and let them raise till they're about double. Okay, so now I'm at the end, and see how it kind of curves in? Just pull it back out. That way it all is about the same length. The goal is to have it as even as you can. And as you can see, it's a little bit longer than my pan. So I'm going to smush it together little by little to pinch it so it stays about the same height. And now here's the pan. And now we're going to take it and we're going to turn it over the same as we did the other one. And we're going to pinch that seam together so that it doesn't tear apart and come open during baking. We're going to turn this end in just a little bit. this one got away from me and it's a little bit long, so my bread's gonna come out a little bit funky. But here's the thing, it's still gonna be homemade cinnamon swirl bread, so do you really care? Don't go for perfect. Go for homemade, have fun with it, and enjoy the process. Because if you don't enjoy the process, you won't cook. And if it has to be perfect, then you won't cook. Or you need to go to chef school. But if you just want to be a home baker, don't worry about whether it looks pretty or not. This is going to be a very ugly loaf, I promise you. But it is what it is. And it's going to be homemade bread. So there we have both of those. We're going to set them over here. You want them in a slightly warm place that doesn't have a breeze. Like if you have a vent that's blowing air conditioning, do not put it under that. You need it to be at least room temperature, slightly warmer, so that it can proof. And by proof, we're really proving that the yeast works. So we want it to raise to about double. So we're going to cover those up while they raise. And now we're going to make the little mini pizzas for supper. Now I'm not ready for supper. Here it's only 1:30, but we can get the pizza crusts ready. So then it's a really simple meal with just some vegetables on the side. And if you don't have any pizza sauce that's store-bought, you can follow a recipe to cook tomato sauce and tomato, either regular canned tomatoes or tomato sauce, or you can use, if you have marinara sauce, take it and pour it into a sieve over a bowl so that you get more of the liquid out, because the difference between marinara sauce and pizza sauce is a lot thicker because you don't want all that water on your bread. So you can get the same effect by draining your marinara sauce a bit to get out some of the more watery liquid. So here I have 4 nice round balls, and here's how you actually shape them. See my fingers? You're constantly folding in the ball so that you end up with a round top, and it really doesn't matter what this looks like. And I can credit my mother-in-law with teaching me this technique, because this is how you also make tortillas. And by the way, this is called a bolillo. And it's actually a dowel that's been sanded and oiled that is just about, I don't know, not quite a foot. And it's made specifically to be able to roll out tortillas. And the reason is because if you make them according to how the authentic way, you're going to roll them out and flip them on this bolillo. But I found that I love it so much as a rolling pin that I use it for everything. So we've let these sit maybe 5 minutes while I'm talking. Start with the one that you rolled up first. I'm gonna make sure we have enough flour. We're gonna push it and see, we're gonna roll it out and keep it as round as we can. But if yours don't come out round, would you rather have homemade pizza that looks like the shapes of states or frozen pizza? Most people would rather have homemade pizza. So don't worry about what it looks like, worry about what it tastes like. So one of the ways you can keep it round is by continually flipping it and rolling it from different directions in small rolls that just stretch the dough a little bit at a time. So now I have one done. I have a pizza stone, so I'm going to go drop this directly on it. If you don't have one, then what you want to do is put this on a cookie sheet that's been sprayed with oil, and then you can put it in the oven. But here, we're only going to put it in for a few minutes. We're going to put it on. And we're going to go make our next one while that's cooking. So again, rolling out. As you can see, this one is not nearly as round. It has a little corner there that has decided it wants to dip in. And if you like thicker pizza crust, roll it out thicker. If you like it thinner, then roll it out really thin. So we're going to put that together. This looks like it got something in the dough, so we're going to pull that out and pinch it and just throw it away. There we go. And now we're going to go check on the other one. Let me take out a cooling wrap to stick it on. Okay, I'm going to grab the pizza paddle that I have. Let's go check the pizza that's in the oven. So see how it started to raise a little bit? We're going to take it out and we're going to let it cool just like that. Now we're going to put the next one in. We're going to do these last two, and then we'll check on our bread loaves. So this one I'm going to leave a little thicker so you can see what that one comes out like. And this one will roll out thinner. And that way you get an idea of what they come out of the oven like depending on how you roll them. So see how this one is much thinner than the other ones? So the interesting thing is you look like you have a bigger pizza, but the truth is they were pretty much all the same. So, okay. Pull out the next one. There was a little bit of steam on that, so we're going to pull it to the other side. Now, if you're making your pizzas right away, you don't need to go through this step of cooking them for a couple of minutes and pulling them out. That's to begin to cook the bottom so that it doesn't get soggy from sitting out for so long. And it also stops the yeast process so that it can sit out on the counter and not continue to raise because you've already got it to the higher heat. So now we'll take out the last one. Let's get that done. Okay, let's push this over so we have room for it. And we'll do the last one while we check our bread. Okay. So now we have some cleanup. And we have our loaves to bake. See how they've started to raise where they're almost the top of the pan now. As soon as that last one comes out, we can go ahead and put the loaves in. And then I'll be stopping the live stream after that. But if you check back when the video is uploaded onto the blog for storiesfromthepantry.com, it'll have pictures of what the bread should look like when it comes out. But you're going to want to bake it for about 12 to 15 minutes. It can be up to 20, depending on how your oven cooks. On mine, I have it for the setting for convection bake, so it has air that's circulating the whole time, so it cooks faster. But if your oven doesn't do that, then it may take you up to like 20 minutes. Don't be worried. Watch for the top to be a nice golden brown, and when you tap on it, that it sounds slightly hollow. And at that point, pull it out. You'll let them sit on the cooling rack for about 2 or 3 minutes so that the sweat can begin to release the bread from the sides of the pan. And then you're going to flip them over and let them completely cool. You can cut them when they're hot, but it will ruin the texture of the whole loaf. So sometimes it's worth it to have completely hot bread out of the oven. So let's check this last one. I left it in here slightly longer because it was thicker. So there we go. So now those are ready for supper. And as you can see, the difference in the texture, or the thickness, depending only on how much you rolled it out. So now we're going to go to putting these in the oven. And we'll go ahead and bake them for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then we'll take them out and we'll cool them, and that finishes.